feeling where you're just so excited about something that you couldn't possibly keep it to yourself? Maybe you read a book or saw a movie, and it was so good you wanted everyone to experience it. You might have even posted a Facebook status because you desperately wanted to share it with the rest of the world. That, my friends, is precisely how we should feel about the gospel. Because these glad tidings are far, far too good to keep to ourselves. What strikes me most about the gospel passage we just heard is its energy. There's a sense of urgency. Matthew doesn't conclude 28 chapters of Jesus' life by urging us to sit still and reflect. No, we've got to tell someone, everyone, all nations, in fact. And did you hear all those verbs? Go, make, baptize, teach, and remember. Matthew probably had a great grammar teacher who didn't let him go anywhere near the passive voice. I know there are some English majors out there, guys. On the contrary, the passage is positively brimming with imperatives. It may be the last verse, but it's not an afterthought. The call to evangelize is imperative, as in vital, essential, absolutely necessary. Putting our faith into action is not an extra credit assignment. We have a responsibility to bear witness. But how exactly do we go about doing that? This is where the first reading comes in handy. If we carried on a bit further with Corinthians, it would have taken us directly to the famous wedding verse, where we are reminded that the greatest of these is love. God is love, and we are fashioned in his image and likeness. We are made to love and to be loved. There's a favorite quotation of mine by St. Augustine that practically echoes through the walls of this building because it's been quoted so many times. But I'm going to say it again because it's so good. Augustine writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." The mission statement at the end of Matthew's gospel encourages us to go out and to help others recognize that the deepest desire of their heart is being in union with God. To be a witness is to have the authority to testify about something, to share knowledge. And what we know as Christians is how to fill that God-shaped hole in their hearts. Our primary vocation is to love. But the beautiful thing is that there are so many different ways to spread that love. That's another reason why the first reading is so fantastic. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. We can fulfill this primary vocation by means of a whole host of other jobs. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone is the same God at work. I see before me a room filled with physicists, accountants, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and so much more. Though we all may have utterly different talents, I know for a fact that my own do not fall into any of the categories I just listed above. The source and summit of all of them is God. It would be incredibly boring if we all manifested God's glory in the same way. And while I adore the English major, I don't think society would function too well if we all specialized in the humanities. Or any field, for that matter. We are the body of Christ, and it only functions with a diversity of parts. But what unites us is that we have all been blessed to know God. But, as Pope John Paul II said, it's not enough to know Christ, we must bring him to everyone. I'd like you all to think about how it is you first came to know God. Because you would not be a disciple yourself had someone else not gone before you and been a witness of faith. Back in February, a group of us attended the UCCC. It's a favorite letter of the alphabet around here. But it stands for the University of California Catholic Conference. We interacted with Catholic students from all different UCs while attending workshops and participating in retreat activities. But I bring this up because the theme of the weekend was this passage from Hebrews. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, and persevere in running the race that lies before us. There are a lot of things I like about this passage, the metaphor of a race being top of that list. But we would not all be gathered together here at Mass if we had not seen the face of Christ in someone else. Be it a relative, friend, campus minister, one of the saints, someone lived out the gospel message in a way that that must have inspired you. Let's not forget this great cloud of witnesses that brought us where we are today. I was recently humbled by a Facebook post that one of my fellow student leaders actually wrote. Gabe and I took a religious studies class together, and after emerging from our final on Tuesday, I was busy fretting about how I couldn't remember who Pope Urban II was and how I had identified Philip the Fair as an emperor known for his good looks, which I'm sure is not the answer Professor Broom was looking for. Meanwhile, Gabe's status pops up on my newsfeed where he writes, "This was one of the best classes I have ever taken. I am amazed and humbled by the amount of courage and sacrifice it took for my faith to be handed down to me. I owe so much to the Christians who faced Nero's fires rather than deny Christ, to St. Athanasius, who suffered exile 5 times to defend the divinity of Christ, to Pope Leo, who met Attila the Hun unarmed and saved his city, to St. Catherine of Siena, whose courage saved the papacy, and to the courage of countless saints throughout the ages. Christians, do not forget your history." Thanks, Gabe, for writing half my reflection. Wow. Martyrs are the extreme example of bearing witness to one's faith. And there are still numerous Christians persecuted in our world today. Meanwhile, it took me 3 years to become comfortable enough to wear a UCC t-shirt around a secular campus. And it wasn't just because there's a typo on the back. How can we continue to be witnesses and make disciples of all nations as we move beyond the comfort of this community? A priest at my home parish once gave a homily about a young couple that continued to visit the same shrine. They stood out to him because they were well below the average age of the rest of the visitors, and they frequented the place nearly every day. When he asked them why, their response was simple: "It's easy to be holy here." His homily went on to discuss how it's not easy for young people to be holy in our world today. I bring this up because I think it's easy to be holy here at the UCC, where being Catholic is cool, and I'm surrounded by peers who share my values. But across the street, where we make decisions in daily life on a secular campus, it can be hard. And out there in the real world, harder still. I urge you, graduates, to challenge yourself. Find a new parish to call home. Continue questioning and growing in your faith as you bear witness. Follow your heart, but keep your UCLA head on your shoulders, too. It would be remiss of me if I didn't quote C.S. Lewis in this reflection. In Mere Christianity, he reminds us that Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. On the contrary, he told us to be not only as harmless as doves, but also as wise as serpents. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. He wants us to be simple, single-minded, affectionate, and teachable, as good children are. But he also wants every bit of intelligence we have to be alert at its job and in first-class fighting trim. To be a witness, you do not need to run around belting psalms at the top of your voice, although it's perfectly fine if you feel compelled to do so. St. Francis of Assisi wisely remarked, "Preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words." Given the length of this reflection and how many of you know how much I love words, it might surprise you to find that one of the most important lessons I learned here was discovering the value of silence. We're all familiar with a host of idioms and cliches about how talk is cheap and actions speak louder than words. And while I agree with the sentiment behind these expressions, I've always been a bit offended by them, given my appreciation for language and the mere fact that our ability to communicate these truths is via words. The point is, I think we need both. There are many ways to show love, as we heard in the first reading. There are some instances where living out the gospel may very well be done best by biting our tongue. I remember a Bible study we did on Job, where we read about how his friends gave him the worst advice ever. They were doing so well when they came and sat silently with him, and then they opened their mouths and urged him to curse God. I think there's a great takeaway here. Sometimes the only response to suffering is your presence, and learning how to sit in silence with another. Jesus doesn't say that any of this will be easy. In fact, it's actually rather intimidating to venture out into the world and be sent forth to all nations. Remember what the disciples were doing before Jesus gave them this pep talk? Mark doesn't sugarcoat it. They fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Even after Jesus walks into the room, Matthew tells us that some doubted. I'm sure many of us may have doubts, worries, and outright fears about the future. But Jesus knows that. That's why he ends by reassuring us. And that's why the very last line of the gospel is my favorite. Remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age. My fellow graduates, God's on our side. So go out and make disciples of all nations.